Home maintenance, above floor French drain for a basement. There are 4 steps for making an above floor French drain in a basement. 1. Cut a 1/2 inch groove into the floor parallel to the wall. 2. Epoxy an aluminum flashing into the groove. 3. Place 2x4 forms around the flashing. 4. Pour concrete into the forms and over the flashing. Here's a picture of the basement before we put the French drain in. That's the east wall where some rain the night before is getting in through the wall there. And during a heavy rain, this north wall here leaks so much that we get about 2 inches of water in the whole basement. So we decided to put a above floor French drain in. And here's a picture of the completed French drain, and that's along the north wall there. You see the concrete curb running parallel to the north wall, and then at the far end is the east wall, and the curb makes a 90 degrees there and goes parallel to the east wall also. And on the left side of the curb in the picture, there's a 2-inch wide drain channel that's also made of concrete, and the drain channel slopes downward from the east wall down to the sump pump on the north wall. Here's the east wall French drain, and along the east wall the curb is 8 inches high, and the reason is that we want the drain to be sloping downhill all the way to the other end, so we started higher at this end. The critical thing is to make sure the drain channel is sloped without any low spots or high spots. And here's a close-up of the curb and the drain channel, and you can see the 2-inch wide drain channel there. And the total length of that curb is 90 feet from the east wall to the north wall. And here we stopped the curb about 2 feet from the far wall, and the floor is sloped downhill at that point towards the sump pump. So the water flows naturally down to the sump pump. And if you look on the left of that curb there, you'll see the drain channel is down to the floor level at this end. The drain channel is about 4 inches deep here. And on the far end, where the curb starts at the east wall, the drain channel is about 1 inch deep. And here's another close-up of the curb, and you see that dashed white line down the center of the curb. What that's indicating is that there's a long piece of aluminum flashing 4 inches high that's running down the center of the curb from one end of the curb to the other end. And here's a picture of the aluminum flashing before we put the concrete curb in there. And you see the white material on the bottom of the flashing. That white material is the epoxy there, and that seals the water to keep the water from getting underneath that flashing. The thing about the concrete curb is that if you didn't have any flashing in there, then what could happen over time is the curb would separate from the floor, and then you'd have a crack under the curb that would allow water to get under the curb and out onto the floor in the basement there. So in order to prevent the water from getting out under the curb, what we did, we used an angle grinder with a diamond blade and cut a groove into the floor parallel to the wall, along the whole length of the wall, the north wall and the east wall, and the groove is about a 1/2 inch deep. And then we put some sealer into the groove, and then we put this aluminum flashing into the groove vertically 4 inches high, and that acts as a barrier to prevent the water from getting out under the curb. If you wanted to, you could have aluminum flashing in place there without pouring a concrete curb on top of it. Just the flashing itself will be enough to hold the water back from getting onto the floor. But there's 2 reasons why we pour the concrete curb on top of the flashing. One is the floor is not sloped downhill to the sump pump. So when water comes through the wall, it just sits there behind the flashing and doesn't flow downhill because the floor is not sloped one way or the other. And the other reason is that over time the flashing could be damaged by someone bumping into it, and then the water would get out on the floor. And here I'm using an angle grinder to cut the groove in the floor. Here I'm drying out the groove there before I put the caulking in there. Also, you have to make sure you vacuum the dust out of the groove. Here I'm putting concrete caulking in the groove there. And here's a self-leveling caulk that we also use in another part of the basement. We experimented with different types of sealer to see which works the best. And here's a picture of the PC11 epoxy. It comes in 2 cans and you mix them together. So we think this is the best sealer for this flashing. And here I'm putting the epoxy into the groove with a putty knife. It's not critical that it's dry with this epoxy because the epoxy will adhere to wet surfaces. But I still wouldn't want any standing water in there. And it's fairly thick material. I use a putty knife and you have to work it in to make sure it gets down to the bottom of the groove so that the groove is completely sealed. And now I'm putting the flashing in. The important thing is that you cut the flashing to fit before you put the epoxy in, because the PC11 epoxy will start to set up in 15 minutes, and if you have to take time to cut and fit the flashing after the epoxy's in, then you run the risk of the epoxy setting up before you get the flashing in. There I'm getting it into the groove there. You have to double check to make sure it's completely in the groove. Sometimes it catches on the edges and it's not completely in. And then after you get the flashing in place, then go back over the groove there to make sure that the groove is completely sealed on both sides of the flashing. And here I'm putting the flashing along the north wall, and already have a piece in there and overlapping about 3 feet, 2 or 3 feet probably. And then also we put sealer between the 2 pieces of flashing that are overlapping. And I'm working with a 15-foot long piece of flashing there. And here I'm working at the corner between the north and the east wall, and it's a little difficult to get the flashing to go around the corner, so I'm cutting a shorter piece about 6 feet long. And here the flashing is complete on the north wall, and you can see it's wet on the left side there, but the floor on the right side is completely dry. So the flashing is definitely keeping the water from going out onto the floor. It rained the night before. And here along the north wall we've got the flashing all in place, and the night before it rained, you can see the gutter there is wet with water, and it got underneath the flashing at this point because there's a crack in the floor 90 degrees to the wall. So what we did was we sealed the crack before we poured the concrete over the flashing. And here I'm putting the 2x4 forms in place, and we nailed them together with 1x4 boards. And we want to place that 2x4 form about 2 inches on the outside of the flashing, so that with a 2-inch concrete on the outside of the flashing and then 2 inches on the inside, you end up with a 4-inch wide curb. So I'm just double checking there to make sure it's about 2 inches from the flashing all along the length of the north wall there. And this is down by the sump pump end. I stopped the form about 2 feet from the wall. And there I'm getting some paint cans. What I'm doing is putting it next to the 2x4s to keep the 2x4s from moving when we start pouring the concrete. There I'm nailing 2 sections of 2x4 together using screws and a 1x4 board that overlaps about 2 feet on each side of the 2x4s. And we use screws because it's easier to take apart after the concrete is set up. And there it's all ready on the outside form there. So the next is the drain channel 2x4. And in order to get the 2x4 for the drain channel sloped downhill, you have to use some objects to prop it up. So there I'm just using that piece of plastic there, and I set that 2x4 on top of it. There I've got a couple more pieces of plastic, and then you want it to slope downhill about 1 or 1 1/4 inches for every 16-foot long 2x4. And there I'm putting the 16-foot long 2x4 in place. And the reason we use these 2x4s is that when we put the concrete in, we make sure we get concrete underneath of it, and then that creates a concrete drain channel that's as straight as the 2x4 without any low spots or high spots, and that allows the water to flow down all the way to the sump pump. And also you want that 2x4 about 2 inches on the wall side of the aluminum flashing. And there we're starting to mix the concrete. When you start mixing it, measure the amount of water that you use so that you don't have to remeasure for every bag of concrete that you mix. Now we're getting ready to pour the concrete over the aluminum flashing and underneath the drain channel 2x4. And there I'm going to put some concrete under that piece of plastic there so that we don't have any gaps. And the critical thing here is to make sure that you get concrete underneath that 2x4, clear up against the bottom of the 2x4, so that you end up with a straight drain channel that's sloping downhill. We used about 10 or 12 bags of concrete in the whole French drain, and then the height of the curb matches up with that outside 2x4. You don't want the concrete on top of that 2x4 next to the wall. And then there I'm going over it with a trowel. I'm creating a V-shaped notch there along that 2x4 so that the water will slope down to the bottom of that drain channel 2x4. And there I'm checking the angle there, making sure it's sloped downhill. And there I'm working on the east wall. That helmet you see, that's protecting me from dust. The helmet's connected to a duct pipe, and the duct pipe is connected to an air conditioning fan that's outside of the basement, and the fan pumps fresh air through the duct into the helmet so that I'm constantly breathing fresh air. And I did work for several days using a dust mask, but the dust mask didn't get all the dust out, and after a while it was bothering my lungs and sinuses, so I started using this PAPR, positive air pressure respirator. There's a completed French drain on the east side. The concrete's been poured there. You can see the concrete is at the top of the outside 2x4, and then the drain channel 2x4 is up higher than the concrete, and it slopes gradually downhill from the right going to the left. And there the forms have been taken off along the north wall there. Here's a close-up of the curb on the north wall again. And we tested this French drain after we were done. We took a 5-gallon bucket of water, poured it way down there at the east end into the drain channel, and we watched it flow all the way down to the sump pump. So the drain channel definitely is working. And then it's been about a year since we put this above floor French drain in, and the basement's completely dry now, even the heaviest rains with most water, and it just doesn't get into the basement anymore. And there you see the water getting down to the end of the drain channel. And it's flowing downhill there, down the floor towards the sump pump. And the floor naturally is sloped downhill at that point, so we didn't put any kind of curb in that area. There are several positive aspects of this above floor French drain. One is that the drain channel is visible, and so if it gets any clogs in it, then you can always clear it out. With a below floor French drain, the drain tile is below the floor, and if it gets clogged up, then it's a difficult task to try to clear it out. Another positive aspect is that you don't have to cut into the concrete floor in order to put the drain tile in. With the above floor French drain, it just sits on top of the floor. Third aspect is that it costs less for time and materials because you're not doing all the work of cutting out the concrete floor, digging a trench, putting in gravel and a drain tile, and then having to replace all that concrete floor that you took out in the first place. And so these are the three positive aspects of the above floor French drain. And then one negative aspect is that the above floor French drain takes up some floor space around the wall. So this is how to construct an above floor French drain, and I hope this video helps, and thanks for watching.